My husband forgot to hang up after our call, and I heard him tell someone, "Our marriage is miserable, but I'm only staying with her because of her family's money." I didn't end the call. I didn't scream, I barely even breathed. I just sat frozen on the edge of our bed, staring at the wall as if it could somehow explain what I had just heard. Then his voice came through the speaker again, calm and brutally honest. "Her dad's loaded, man. You think I'd still be in this marriage if there wasn't a trust fund behind it?" The other voice laughed softly, muffled as if they were talking over drinks. "So you're really just going to wait it out?" There was a brief pause, then he answered calmly, almost like he was proud of the plan he'd made. 2 more years, maybe 3. "Then I'll have enough to leave. She won't see it coming, she's too comfortable." I ended the call, my hand didn't shake, that would come later. In that moment I just stared at my phone as if it had delivered a death sentence. In a way, it had, not the death of a person, but the death of the life I believed I had. 3 years of marriage unraveled in a matter of seconds. Every late-night conversation, every laugh, every argument we'd patched up with apologies suddenly felt like part of a performance. I leaned back and let the weight of what I'd heard settle deep inside me. The betrayal didn't arrive with tears or screaming. It came with silence, an empty, unsettling silence where even my heartbeat sounded too loud. I opened the drawer where I kept our wedding photos. There was one we both loved, a candid shot of us laughing in the rain, completely soaked, looking ridiculous and happy. I used to believe that moment was real. Now I couldn't stop wondering if he'd already been calculating everything back then. Maybe he hadn't seen the woman standing beside him. Maybe he'd only seen the daughter of a successful businessman. I remembered how quickly we got engaged and how effortlessly he charmed my family. My dad, who rarely trusted people easily, took the longest to warm up to him. But even he eventually admitted, "He seems like a good man." My mom had smiled proudly and said, "You picked someone with good instincts." Had I, that night I didn't sleep. I lay beside the man who had just admitted he didn't love me, who saw our marriage as nothing more than a temporary investment. His breathing was slow and peaceful. I wondered if he had any idea how painfully loud the silence felt from my side of the bed. The next morning, I acted like nothing had happened. I made coffee the way I always did. He came downstairs in sweatpants, kissed the top of my head and smiled. "Sleep okay?" he asked. "Yeah, you slept like a rock," he said, pouring his usual half cup with no sugar. "You working from home today?" I nodded. "Just a few calls." From across the kitchen, I watched him carefully, the way he leaned against the counter scrolling through his phone. The quick glance at our shared calendar, the notification he tapped before instantly swiping it away. I didn't ask about it. I'd stopped wanting answers. After he left, I didn't cry. I opened my laptop and stared at a blank document. I was supposed to be reviewing contracts. Instead, I opened a note and wrote down every word I'd heard on that phone call. I needed a record, not for court, but for myself, because I knew there would be days when I'd question my own memory, convince myself I'd misunderstood, or wonder if I was overreacting. That note would remind me that I wasn't imagining things. That afternoon, I drove to my parents' house, but I never went inside. I sat in the driveway with the engine off, staring at the front porch. I couldn't tell them, not yet. My dad would ask for proof. My mom would blame herself, and I couldn't carry their heartbreak along with my own. I drove back home before he arrived. I lit a candle, turned on soft music, and made dinner. When he walked through the door, he smiled the way he always did. "Smells amazing in here," he said before kissing my cheek. "I missed you," I smiled back. "I missed you too." That night, we ate dinner together. He told me about a pitch meeting that had gone well and said someone seemed interested in his startup idea. I asked questions and acted supportive. I knew he was hoping my father would eventually invest. That had always been the unspoken plan. After dinner, he poured us wine and turned on the fireplace. We watched a movie I barely paid attention to. He pulled me closer. I let him, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to memorize the routine. Every moment of intimacy, every practiced gesture, I needed to see it all clearly if I was ever going to untangle the truth. I went to bed before him, telling him I was tired. He smiled and said he'd be up soon. I lay there staring at the ceiling, letting his words replay in my mind. Too comfortable, she won't see it coming. I had seen it. And I wasn't going to stay comfortable for much longer. The next morning I woke before the alarm. It wasn't because I couldn't sleep, it was because I didn't want to. The bed felt unfamiliar. His presence beside me, the steady rise and fall of his chest, his fingers lightly brushing my arm, those things used to make me feel safe. Now they made my skin crawl. I slipped out of bed quietly, showered in silence, and stood in front of the mirror for a long time. It was strange how ordinary I looked. No one would have guessed what I knew. No one would have imagined that less than 48 hours earlier, I'd overheard my husband calmly planning his exit from the marriage we'd built together. Not because it was failing. Not because we'd grown apart, but because I came with money. In the kitchen, I started making coffee before realizing I didn't even want it. I poured the water anyway. The routine gave me something to focus on. When he came downstairs, his hair still damp from the shower and wearing the same navy sweatshirt he always wore on work-from-home days, I kept my expression calm. "You're up early," he said with a yawn. "Didn't sleep well. Too much wine last night?" I gave him a small smile. "Maybe." He kissed the top of my head. I flinched, only slightly, not enough for him to notice. Or maybe he'd grown so used to my quiet compliance that he no longer noticed anything unless it interrupted the story he'd created. After breakfast, I sat at the kitchen island with my laptop open and a calendar full of meetings I had no intention of attending. I stared at the screen while my thoughts drifted. 3 years. That's how long we'd been married, almost exactly. And somehow, in less than 3 minutes of an overheard phone call, I was being forced to question every moment of it. Had he been lying when he told me I looked beautiful in the mornings? When he cried at our wedding, was that real or just another performance? And when he talked about having children, was that part of the plan too? Build deeper ties, make it harder for me to leave, harder to separate the money from the marriage. I thought about our first year together in the tiny apartment downtown, sharing cheap wine on the fire escape because we couldn't afford anything better. I had believed in us then. I had believed in him. I remembered telling my sister, "He's the kind of man who makes the world feel solid." Maybe he did, until the foundation cracked. Around noon, I stepped away from my computer and sat on the edge of the bed. I let myself go back through every memory slowly, deliberately. I wanted to stop romanticizing the past. I needed to strip away the warm filter I'd placed over our marriage and finally see it for what it really was. The way he always insisted we eat at expensive restaurants whenever my parents were in town. The way he went quiet whenever money came up, unless someone was offering us something. The time he convinced me to lease a new car in my name because my credit score was better. Back then, I called it practicality. Now I saw it for what it really was. He hadn't fallen out of love. He'd never truly been in love to begin with. I picked up my phone and opened our photo gallery. There were hundreds of pictures, vacations, birthdays, lazy kitchen selfies. I zoomed in on one of his smiling face, his arm wrapped around me, looking perfect for the camera. But his eyes weren't looking at me. They were looking just past the camera lens, as if he was already focused on whatever came next. I saved a few of the newer photos, not out of nostalgia, but for documentation. A sharp instinct told me to start collecting things, like a woman preparing for a storm no one else could see. By evening, I felt completely numb. He was in the living room working on something he called a pitch deck for investors. He didn't offer any details. He never did, not with me. He asked what I wanted for dinner. I told him I wasn't hungry. He offered to cook anyway. "Let me take care of you." I watched him move around the kitchen, humming to himself. It was the same old indie song he used to hum when we first started dating. I couldn't help wondering if he hummed it for her too. I didn't ask. I barely spoke that night, but I noticed everything. The way he kept watching me from the corner of his eye, the slight hesitation before he brought my food over, almost as if he sensed something had changed. When he finally sat beside me, he asked, "You've been quiet, just tired, work stress?" Something like that. He nodded and rested a hand on my thigh. This time I didn't move or flinch. I was too far beneath the surface, too deep in that place where grief slowly transforms into clarity, because that's what was happening. I wasn't falling apart, I was waking up. From that moment on, every move he made became something I studied, a performance I'd watched for years without realizing I was the audience. It had been 3 days since the phone call. 3 days of watching him brush his teeth, make coffee, kiss my cheek goodbye, all while knowing what he'd said about me, about us. The strangest part was how normal he seemed, not guilty. Not nervous, just ordinary. Maybe that was the most unsettling thing of all, that someone could plan your betrayal and still sleep peacefully beside you. Thursday morning, he offered to drive me to work, something he hadn't done in months. "You look tired," he said as he adjusted the rearview mirror. "Figured I'd make your morning a little easier." I almost said yes. The old me would have been touched by the gesture. Now I wondered what had prompted it. Was this just part of the routine? Keep the wife happy, keep the money flowing. I have a stop to make after work, I said instead. I'll drive myself. He nodded without hesitation. No problem, dinner out tonight. That steakhouse you like, the one my father had recommended, the one we'd only been to twice, both times when my parents were paying. Sure, I said. At work, I couldn't concentrate. Every email felt pointless. Every meeting dragged on. I kept replaying the phone call, trying to remember the exact tone he used when he said, "She won't even see it coming." It had sounded so casual, almost bored, like he was talking about the weather. During lunch, I sat in my car and called my sister, not because I was ready to tell her the truth. I just needed to hear a familiar voice. "You sound different," she said after a few minutes of small talk. "Everything okay? Just tired, work stuff. How's your husband?" The question lingered longer than it should have. "He's fine." "Same as always. That doesn't sound very convincing." I forced a laugh. "I'm just in a weird mood, ignore me." After we hung up, I sat there thinking about what she'd said, same as always. That was the problem, he was exactly the same. While my entire world had shifted, nothing had changed for him, because for him, this had always been the plan. That evening at dinner, he ordered wine without asking what I wanted. Then he raised his glass. "To us. And the future we're building." As he cut into his steak, he asked, "Do you ever think about what you want our life to look like 5 years from now?" I tilted my head. "What do you mean?" "I don't know. Bigger things. Your family has such an incredible foundation, such a strong network. Sometimes I think we could be doing more with it." The words sounded rehearsed, as though he'd practiced them. "More like what? I don't know, partnerships, investments. Building something that lasts." He was testing the waters, trying to see how open I was to involving my family's money in his plans. "That's pretty vague," I said. He laughed, but it sounded hollow. "I guess I'm still figuring it out. It just feels like we have so many opportunities we're not taking advantage of." Later that night, I watched him sleep. His breathing was slow and steady. Peaceful, there wasn't the slightest sign of guilt or worry, just a man resting after another productive day of manipulation. I lay awake until nearly 3 in the morning. I wasn't thinking about revenge or confrontation. I was trying to understand how I'd missed it. How someone could share a bed with you, eat meals with you, make plans for the future with you, all while quietly planning to leave once they'd taken everything they wanted. The next morning, I decided to pay attention differently, not to snoop, not to investigate, not yet. I simply wanted to see him clearly, to stop filling in the blanks with my own hope. When he said, "I love you," before leaving for work, I watched his eyes. They looked just past me, unfocused, like he was reading from a script. When he texted me at lunch, "Thinking of you, beautiful," I noticed it arrived at exactly the same time it had the previous 2 days. When he came home that evening with grocery store flowers, I realized he'd done the exact same thing the month before. Same flowers, same timing, same casual smile. "Saw these and thought of you." It wasn't spontaneous affection, it was maintenance. That night, while we ate leftover takeout, he asked about my day with the same interested expression he always wore. But the moment I mentioned a problem with a client, he nodded once and immediately shifted the conversation back to his own work. He hadn't really been listening. He'd just been waiting for his turn to speak. None of these behaviors were new, they'd always been there. I'd simply been too willing to mistake routine for love. By Sunday, I felt like I was living with a stranger, not because he'd changed, because I had finally seen him clearly. The man I'd fallen in love with had been a carefully constructed version of himself. The performance was so polished, so consistent, that even he seemed to believe it. That afternoon, while he watched a game in the living room, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee I didn't even want and began making a mental list. Not of evidence, not of proof. Just of all the things I'd noticed, things that suddenly made sense. How he always suggested expensive restaurants whenever my parents were joining us. How he'd become strangely quiet whenever I talked about helping pay off his student loans. How every business idea somehow required connections my father could provide. How he'd pushed for a joint bank account only 6 months into our marriage. None of it was dramatic, none of it was obvious. That's what made it so effective. I wasn't dealing with a villain. I was dealing with someone who had turned our entire relationship into a long-term business strategy, and he was so good at it that he probably didn't even see it as betrayal, just smart planning. By Monday, the performance resumed like clockwork. He kissed my forehead before leaving for work and said, "Don't work too hard," with a soft smile. I stood in the hallway watching him grab his keys, straighten his jacket, and walk out the door like he had somewhere important to be. He didn't know I already suspected that most of his meetings weren't real. That morning, I started documenting things, not dramatic evidence, just details. I created a private note on my phone and titled it Observations. It wasn't meant to be legal evidence. It was for me, a reminder whenever I started doubting myself that none of this was just in my head. Tuesday, 12:47 p.m. Thinking of you text. Same time as yesterday. Used the joint card for an online consultation service. 1 hour and 45 minutes unaccounted for. Suggested a restaurant for next week, the same one my father mentioned during our last family dinner. None of them were smoking guns, but together they painted a picture, and I was learning how to read it. I started paying closer attention to our finances, not by hacking passwords or digging through his files, but by noticing patterns. He always offered to pay when we were out with friends, but he used our joint card. He became vague whenever I brought up budgeting. And every time I suggested cutting back on spending, he redirected the conversation. By Wednesday, I noticed something new, panic. It was subtle, barely visible beneath the surface. He came home early, something he never did during the week, and said he just wanted to spend time with me. I was polite, surprised, but not warm, he noticed. "You seem off lately," he said, watching me a little too closely. "Just tired. Is it work us?" "Mostly work," I smiled gently. "Nothing you did." It wasn't entirely a lie. He hadn't done anything new, he was simply continuing what he'd been doing from the very beginning. I had just started seeing it. That night, I made a subtle move. I casually mentioned that my dad was making changes in the family business, restructuring things, reallocating a few assets. I didn't explain further, I just let the words hang in the air. He looked up from his drink. "Is everything okay with him?" "Probably, he's just being more careful lately." I caught the brief flash of concern in his eyes before he covered it with a nod. "He always thinks 10 steps ahead," he said. I smiled. "It runs in the family." The next day, he asked if I wanted to get away for the weekend, just us, maybe a cabin up north. Somewhere quiet, I almost laughed. A spontaneous romantic getaway wasn't his style, not unless he needed something. "Maybe next weekend," I said. "I have a few things I need to take care of first." He didn't argue, but that night he was more affectionate than usual. He held me a little longer, watched me while I read, and tried to start a conversation about long-term goals, using phrases like real estate, retirement, and generational wealth. I listened quietly. The truth was, I didn't know what my long-term future looked like anymore. I only knew it no longer included him. By Friday, I made a decision. I wasn't going to wait for the perfect moment. I wasn't going to wait for more evidence or another mistake. I'd already seen enough. I didn't need a complete plan. I just needed to start pulling away strategically, calmly, without giving him a reason to panic. I started with my accounts, not the joint ones, mine. The personal savings account I hadn't touched since college. I scheduled an appointment with my bank manager and opened a new account in my name only, no digital links connecting it to him. I transferred a modest amount, enough to begin creating some distance, but not enough to raise suspicion. That weekend, I visited my parents under the excuse of helping them organize paperwork for tax season. I didn't tell them the truth, not yet. Instead, I asked casual questions about legal protections, the family trust, and how they screened people connected to the family business. My dad looked at me from across the kitchen table. "Something on your mind?" I shook my head, just being cautious. He didn't push, he never did. That was something I'd always loved about him. He gave people the space to come to him when they were ready. Saturday night, after I got home, my husband casually brought up the idea of us starting a business together. I could tell he'd practiced the conversation. "We've got the brand, the last name, the connections. All we need is the right concept." "What kind of concept?" I asked. "I'm thinking wellness. Something lifestyle-focused. Everyone's into that now. Do you have experience in that space?" "Not yet, but with the right team, the right pitch." "Your dad might even know someone." He let the sentence trail off. I didn't nod, I didn't encourage him, I simply looked at him, and for the first time I didn't see my husband, I saw the plan. The calculation, the man behind the mask, and he was starting to sweat. It showed in small ways. He checked his phone more often, even while we were talking. He glanced at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. The effortless confidence he'd carried for years had started to crack. Sunday morning, I mentioned that my family was quietly reorganizing some financial matters. I said it while stirring my tea without looking at him. Casual, measured. "Is that serious?" he asked immediately. Not really, I replied. My dad's just becoming stricter about how the assets are managed. He nodded slowly. That makes sense. Smart move, but I noticed he never touched his coffee after that. When I stepped away to answer a call from my sister, I heard him pacing across the kitchen floor. That evening he was unusually attentive. He cooked dinner without being asked, lit candles, and asked what kind of vacation I'd choose if we could simply disappear for a while. Somewhere quiet, I said, no signal, just fresh air and space. He smiled as though that meant I still belonged to him, but the smile looked tired around the edges. Monday morning I started researching. Nothing dramatic, just gathering information. I looked up financial consultants, read reviews, and bookmarked a few contacts. I researched storage facilities. I searched phrases like financial manipulation in marriage and protecting assets during separation. I wasn't ready to act on any of it, but knowledge felt like armor. That afternoon, while he was at what he called a client meeting, I walked through the house with fresh eyes. I wasn't snooping, I was simply noticing. The way he positioned his laptop so the screen always faced away from common areas. The way he kept his phone face down during meals. The stack of business cards on his desk that hadn't been there the week before. When he came home, he seemed irritated. He said the meeting hadn't gone well but refused to explain. Over dinner, he pitched another idea, an app focused on financial literacy for couples. People trust families with a legacy, he said, gesturing with his fork. If we position ourselves as a team building wealth together, there's real potential. He always used words like we and team whenever he talked about money. But somehow he only ever meant my family's money. Tuesday, I made one small but deliberate move. I changed the password to my personal bank account, the one he'd never had access to in the first place. It wasn't that I thought he was monitoring it, but I wanted to start creating invisible boundaries. That evening, he suggested we go out for dinner. He said he'd made a reservation somewhere special. The restaurant was beautiful, too beautiful for a random Tuesday night. When we arrived, the hostess greeted us warmly, but I noticed her glance at him with an expression I couldn't quite place. Maybe familiarity, maybe confusion. Throughout dinner, he was more energetic than usual, talking about opportunities and building something that would last. But beneath all the excitement, I sensed something else, an urgency that hadn't been there before. I've been thinking, he said as he cut into his steak. We should be more intentional about our financial future, maybe bring your dad into a few conversations about investments. There it was. The real reason for the fancy dinner, the candles, and the sudden romance. That's pretty vague, I said. He laughed, but it sounded forced. I guess I'm still figuring out the details. On Wednesday, I told him I'd be working late. Instead, I drove around for 2 hours just thinking. I ended up sitting in a coffee shop, making quiet lists in my mind, not evidence lists but clarity lists. What I knew, what I suspected, what I still needed to understand. When I got home, he was waiting for me. He said he'd been worried and asked if everything was okay with my family with work with us. Everything's fine, I said. Just busy. He studied my face as if he were trying to read something hidden there. You'd tell me if something was wrong, right? He asked. I met his eyes. Of course, it was the first outright lie I'd told him since all this began, and surprisingly, it came easily. Thursday morning, he seemed restless. He made coffee but never drank it. He started conversations only to let them fade halfway through. Finally, he asked, "Do you feel like something's off between us?" "Not really," I replied. "Why?" He shrugged. "It just feels like something has changed." I looked at him, really looked at the man I'd shared a bed with for 3 years. The man who cried at our wedding, who held my hand at my grandmother's funeral, and who had apparently been calculating the end of our marriage from the very beginning. "Maybe you're just stressed," I said. He nodded slowly. "Maybe," but we both knew it wasn't stress. It was the sound of a house of cards beginning to shake, and I hadn't even started blowing yet. By Friday morning, he was quietly unraveling. I watched him open and close the same kitchen drawer twice, as though he'd forgotten what he was looking for. He asked where I'd left the phone charger he always used, even though it was still plugged into the same outlet it had always been. He spilled coffee grounds across the counter and didn't clean them up. He just stared at the mess for a moment before walking away. I made sure not to match his energy. My voice stayed calm. My movement stayed steady. I casually asked if he had any plans for the day. He said he might take a few meetings but didn't explain further. "Anything interesting?" I asked. He shrugged. "Nothing final yet." Final, a strange choice of words. After he left, I stood quietly in the doorway, letting the silence settle around me. I hadn't confronted him, I hadn't accused him of anything. I'd only changed my behavior slightly, dropped a few vague comments, and already he was beginning to fold inward. That afternoon, I withdrew $200 from my personal account. I didn't need the cash, I simply wanted it in my wallet, a reminder that not everything was shared and not everything could be touched. When he came home that evening, he brought flowers again. The same grocery store bouquet, the same bottle of wine he thought I liked. He placed them on the counter and smiled. Thought you could use something nice after the kind of week you've had. I thanked him, arranged the flowers in a vase, poured the wine, and sat with him in the living room while he talked about a new opportunity. Apparently, he'd met someone through one of my father's colleagues. Total coincidence, he said, his eyes lighting up. I didn't even realize he was connected to your family until halfway through the conversation. Of course, and now, I asked. He smiled. He's interested in hearing more. Wants to grab coffee next week. I nodded. Sounds promising. Then he added casually, do you think your dad would mind if I mentioned his name once or twice? There it was again, the script. The careful layering, say it casually enough and maybe it won't sound like exploitation. Depends on the situation, I replied. He laughed. Right. Gotta be smart about it. I watched him take another sip of wine. His hands were steady again. The nervous energy he'd carried that morning had disappeared. He believed he was back in control. But I'd already seen the cracks and I wasn't going to forget them. Saturday morning, he suggested brunch. I agreed. I wanted to see how far he'd go, how much charm he could still summon while standing on a sinking ship. At the restaurant, he smiled constantly, joked with the server just enough to seem confident without crossing the line, then nodded toward the couple sitting nearby. They've been arguing the whole time, he said. He always noticed everyone else's tension, never his own. Over coffee, he leaned forward. I was thinking maybe we should open a new joint account. Something just for investments, separate from the household account. I tilted my head. Why? It would be cleaner, he said quickly, less overlap. More clarity for both of us. He said it as though he was offering transparency. You don't think the one we already have works? It does, he answered immediately. I just think we're at a point where we should be more strategic. Strategic. Lately, every word he used sounded like it came straight from a business handbook. That night, I started my own strategy. I backed up every financial document I could legally access, tax returns, loan records, and the history of our joint account. I didn't go through his devices. I didn't need to. The information he'd already volunteered was enough. Sunday, he was restless again. He asked if I wanted to go for a drive. I said no. He paced around the house, pretended to clean, checked his phone every 10 minutes, and asked 3 different times whether I'd spoken to my parents recently. Not since last week, I replied. Why? No reason, just wondering if they'd mentioned that restructuring you talked about. I shrugged. Not really, just that things are changing. He nodded, his lips pressed tightly together. That night he came into the bedroom later than usual. I pretended to be asleep. He stood in the doorway for several seconds, then he sat on the edge of the bed as if he wanted to say something. But he never did. Instead, he stood up and quietly walked back out. I waited another full minute before opening my eyes. The sound of someone falling apart wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was nothing more than the silence that followed when a lie finally stopped working. By Monday, the panic had set in, not the dramatic kind, nothing shouted or thrown. Just the quiet kind that hums beneath the surface, distorting everything. He started texting me more than usual throughout the day, not sweet or flirty, just overly attentive. What are you up to? Thinking about you. Let me know if you need anything. I replied only when I felt like it, short answers, no emojis. I wasn't trying to be cold, I just didn't feel the need to play along anymore. After the 3rd message, he sent a voice note. You've been quiet today. Everything okay? His voice was careful and soft, the kind people use when they're afraid something is slipping through their fingers. That evening, he showed up at my office without warning. He was standing in the lobby holding coffee and a bag of pastries from a cafe I used to love. Figured you could use a break, he said, trying to sound casual. But his eyes were searching my face, looking for clues. Everything okay? I asked. Yeah, just missed you, I forced a smile. Thanks for the coffee. He stayed longer than he should have, then kissed me goodbye, not on the cheek or forehead, on the lips, deliberately, like he wanted my coworkers to see it. Like he needed witnesses. That evening at home, he cooked dinner again, 3 nights in a row. He even lit the candles we hadn't used in months and tried to recreate a meal we had years ago on a rainy night. Remember this? He asked, pointing at the pasta. I nodded. You added way too much garlic that time. He smiled, but I could see the strain behind it. After dinner, he suggested we take a few days off together. Just us, let's disconnect from everything. Go somewhere quiet. He kept saying quiet as if it were the answer to everything. Maybe, I said before heading upstairs. As I walked away, I caught his reflection in the hallway mirror. He was drying the dishes with much more force than necessary. By Wednesday, the flowers came back. This time they were delivered to my office, bigger, more expensive, with a handwritten note that read, "Just because you deserve the world." It didn't feel romantic, it felt like pressure. My coworker smiled when she saw them. He's really making an effort, huh? I simply nodded. The next morning, he asked if I wanted to look at houses. Not to move right now, he clarified. Just to see what's out there, dream a little. Why? I asked. He hesitated before answering. It's good to have a vision, but I knew what it really was. He was trying to secure something, trying to redirect the conversation toward a future that depended on him. Thursday night, I decided to test something. While casually scrolling through my phone, I mentioned that my family might be scaling back some investments, that my father had become more private and wasn't discussing finances as openly anymore. He didn't react immediately, but later that night I caught him in the hallway whispering into his phone. I couldn't make out the words, but his voice sounded tense, urgent. Friday morning, he brought me breakfast in bed. He hadn't done that since our first year of marriage. He sat beside me, watching me eat as though I might disappear. I've been thinking, he said quietly. We should talk more, really talk. I set the tray aside. What do you want to talk about? Everything, us, our future. How we're doing, how do you think we're doing? He swallowed. I don't know, sometimes you seem far away. Do I? He reached for my hand. I don't want to lose what we've built. I let him hold my hand. I let him say everything he thought would fix us, but I didn't say those words back, I just listened. Because it wasn't about fixing anything anymore. It was about watching him realize he was losing. That night he cried, not loudly, not dramatically. Just a few silent tears while sitting on the couch pretending to scroll through his phone. I didn't ask why, I didn't comfort him, he didn't explain. He simply wiped his face and kept pretending. And for the first time, I think he knew I had seen it. By Saturday morning, something inside me had changed. The notebook I'd been keeping quietly and methodically was almost full. Dates, patterns. Small inconsistencies. Every page had brought me a little closer to the truth. Looking back over weeks of careful observations, I realized I couldn't keep pretending much longer. He made breakfast again, too much food, too many questions. Want to go for a walk later? Should we book that trip for next weekend? Have you talked to your mom recently? No, I answered. Why? Just wondering, he replied. You've seemed a little distant from them lately. I hadn't been distant, I'd simply been deciding what I was going to tell them. That afternoon, I made my decision. I called my parents and asked if I could come over. I need to talk about something important. When I arrived, they were already waiting in the kitchen, concern written across their faces. I sat down and took a deep breath. I need to tell you something about him, about our marriage. I told them about the phone call I had overheard, the exact words he used. The calm, casual way he spoke about our marriage as if it were nothing more than a financial arrangement. I stayed calm, no tears, no anger, just the truth. My mother covered her mouth with her hand. My father leaned back in his chair and stayed silent for a long moment. How long have you known? He finally asked. 2 weeks, and you're certain about what you heard? Completely. He nodded slowly. What do you want to do? I appreciated that he didn't try to fix it or talk me out of my feelings. He simply asked what I needed. I'm not sure yet, I admitted, but I wanted you both to know before I make any decisions. My mother reached across the table and squeezed my hand. We're here for you, whatever you need. Driving home, I felt lighter, not because the problem had been solved, but because I wasn't carrying it alone anymore. That evening, I suggested we go out for dinner. I needed one more test. I wanted to see whether he could still keep up the performance when I stopped giving him the responses he expected. He brightened instantly. Really, where do you want to go? Somewhere nice, I replied. Your choice. Of course, he picked the steakhouse. During dinner, he was unusually animated, talking about summer plans, redecorating the guest room, and a business idea he'd been working on. He even ordered wine without asking what I wanted. Halfway through the meal, I asked a simple question. What would you do if my family's financial situation changed? I cut into my salmon as casually as I could. He froze for a second. What do you mean, if the trust were restructured, or if my dad stepped back from some investments? Would that change your plans? He slowly put down his fork. Why are you asking? Just curious. He studied my face before forcing a smile. It wouldn't change anything, I mean. Sure, some opportunities might look different, but that's not why I'm here. No, he reached across the table and took my hand. I'm here because I love you. I let him hold it, but I didn't squeeze back. That's good to know, I said quietly, but the confidence he'd carried all evening was gone. His eyes had changed. The easy smile had been replaced by something much more cautious, much more calculated. When we got home, he barely spoke. He said he had a few emails to catch up on and disappeared into his office. Later that night, I could hear him talking quietly on the phone behind the closed door. I didn't try to listen. I didn't need to. I'd already seen enough. That night, I lay in bed while he worked late. I stared at the ceiling, replaying our conversation over dinner. I kept thinking about how quickly his expression had changed when I mentioned my family's money, and how his first concern had been the opportunities it could bring instead of my family's well-being. Then my mind went back to the phone call that had started all of this, the casual cruelty in his voice when he called our marriage awful, the laugh when he called me clueless. That's when I realized I'd been asking myself the wrong question. It wasn't whether I could forgive him, it was whether I wanted to spend another day pretending I didn't know who he really was. The answer was simple, I didn't. By Sunday afternoon, the decision had settled in. There was no dramatic breakdown, no screaming or tears, just a quiet, steady certainty. I was done pretending. That evening, he suggested we have dinner at home. He said he wanted to cook something special for me. Just us, he said, no distractions. I agreed. He spent the afternoon marinating chicken and chopping herbs as if he were trying to impress me. He lit candles, set the table with neatly folded napkins, and brought out the wine glasses we usually saved for when my parents visited. You look beautiful, he said as I came downstairs. Thank you, I replied. He served dinner with a smile and raised his glass. To new beginnings. I lifted mine but didn't take a sip. We talked about nothing important, the weather, our neighbor's new car, and an old college friend he had run into the previous week. I let him lead the conversation. I let him keep the illusion alive just a little longer. Then, as he cleared the plates, I quietly said, I want to talk about the call. He froze with his back to me, his hands gripping the edge of the sink. What call? I waited until he turned around, his face carefully expressionless. The one you forgot to hang up. His mouth opened, then closed. I heard everything, I said calmly. Every single word. He looked down at the floor before meeting my eyes. It wasn't what you think. You said our marriage was awful. I was just venting. I was having a bad day. You said you're only with me because of my family's money. I was being stupid. I didn't mean it. You know how guys talk when they're frustrated. You called me clueless. His jaw tightened. It was a joke, a bad one. I was angry about something else. You said I'd never see it coming. Silence filled the room. Finally, he sat down across from me and leaned forward. Look, I've made mistakes. I've gotten comfortable with your family's generosity. Maybe I've taken advantage of it, but that doesn't mean I don't love you, doesn't it? No, he said firmly. I married you because I love you. Everything else is just circumstantial. I studied his face, watching him try so hard to look sincere. When we first met, I said slowly, how long did it take before you asked about my family? He blinked. What do you mean? The first date, the second. When did you ask what my father did for a living? I don't remember exactly. It was our second date. We were having coffee. You asked what my parents did, and the moment I mentioned the family business, you suddenly became very interested. You kept asking more questions. That's normal. People ask about each other's families. You researched my father before our third date. I remember because you mentioned an article about him that had just been published, when you couldn't have found unless you were looking. A faint flush spread across his face. I was interested in your life. That's what people do when they're dating. Is it? He stood up, clearly frustrated. You're twisting everything. You're making it sound calculated when it wasn't. Then explain the pattern. What pattern? The way you always suggest expensive places when my parents are paying. The way you go quiet whenever I talk about budgeting our own money. The way every business idea somehow involves my father's connections. Those are just practical considerations. For who? He ran a hand through his hair. You're being unfair. You're taking normal relationship dynamics and making them sound sinister. Normal, yes, couples build on each other's strengths. They use what each person brings to the relationship. And what do I bring? He hesitated for just a second. You bring yourself, your intelligence, your kindness. You're my family's money. That's not what I was going to say. but it's what you were thinking." He sank back into his chair, suddenly looking exhausted. "I don't know how to convince you." "You can't," I said quietly, "because I heard what you really believed when you thought no one was listening." He stayed silent for a long moment. "Then what happens now? I think you should stay somewhere else for a while. For how long, I don't know yet." He nodded slowly, almost as if he'd expected the answer. "And us? There is no us, not anymore." He looked at me across the flickering candlelight, the carefully prepared dinner now sitting cold between us. "I never meant to hurt you," he said softly. "I know," I replied, "you just never meant for me to find out." After he left, I locked the door behind him. He texted, called, sent flowers, letters, and voice messages begging for another chance. He apologized for getting caught, not for what he had done. Every message tried to remind me of our good memories, but I already knew the truth. I never replied. When the divorce process began, he asked for mediation and tried to frame everything as fair. My lawyer uncovered hidden bank transfers, fake business expenses, and money sent to an old college girlfriend. His explanations didn't match the evidence. For the first time, I wasn't heartbroken, I was angry. He had quietly used me and assumed I would never notice. During mediation, the documents spoke louder than words. He walked away with no claim to my family's assets or trust. Within 3 months, everything was finalized. My name was restored, the joint accounts were closed, and our lives were legally separated. I moved into a smaller home, changed my number, and deleted his final email after reading it once. Closure didn't come from forgiveness, it came from silence. Therapy, my family, and time helped me rebuild myself. I stopped living for someone else's approval and started living for myself again. The last I heard, he had moved to another city and reinvented himself online as a successful entrepreneur. I never looked back. I no longer needed proof of what happened because I had already reclaimed my life. In the end, I wasn't the woman he tried to use for his own ambitions. I was the woman who saw the truth, stood her ground, walked away, and finally found peace. That was the story worth remembering.